The unthinkable happened that day at Cincinnati Zoo. A little boy fell into a gorilla's enclosure, and the world held its breath. What transpired in those terrifying moments would forever change how we understand these magnificent creatures, touching the hearts of millions across the globe. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary sparkled under the May sunshine, a perfect Saturday that had drawn families from across Bristol and beyond. Children squealed with delight near the penguin pool while parents queued for refreshments, the sweet aroma of freshly baked scones and strawberry jam wafting through the air. Teenagers snapped photos for social media, and elderly couples strolled arm in arm along the winding paths, pausing occasionally to read informational plaques about conservation efforts. Among the cheerful crowd stood Lena Callahan, her fingers wrapped around her son's small hand with unmistakable tension. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped Jamie's palm, eyes constantly scanning the bustling sanctuary for unseen dangers. The 7-year-old boy bounced on his toes beside her, his excitement barely contained as he pointed toward the primate section. "Mom, can we see the gorillas now? Please?" Jamie tugged at her sleeve, his bright eyes pleading. Lena nodded reluctantly, checking her watch. "Just for a little while, then lunch," she replied, her voice carrying the familiar edge of anxiety that had colored their outings since Jamie's father had left them 3 years ago. She'd become overprotective, constantly imagining worst-case scenarios, a habit her therapist in Manchester had encouraged her to address. As they approached the primate area, the crowd thickened. Lena fumbled in her handbag for tissues, releasing Jamie's hand for just a moment. That single instant was all it took. The boy, spotting a plush silverback gorilla displayed in the gift shop window, darted away through the forest of adult legs. "Jamie!" Lena called, panic rising in her throat as she pushed through the crowd. She spotted him 20 meters ahead, pressing his face against the shop window, mesmerized by the stuffed animal. When he saw his mother approaching, Jamie darted away again, giggling. He ran toward the gorilla enclosure, where visitors lined the viewing platform. In his excitement, the child squeezed between 2 adults and climbed onto the lower safety railing for a better view. "Jamie, get down from there!" Lena screamed, lunging forward. Time seemed to slow as several horrifying seconds unfolded before dozens of witnesses. Jamie's sneaker slipped on the metal bar. His small arms windmilled desperately as he lost balance. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as the boy toppled backward over the railing, plummeting 4 meters into the enclosure below. The sickening thud as Jamie's body hit the mulch and moss silenced the entire viewing area. He lay motionless. Among the wet leaves, a tiny crumpled form in a blue t-shirt. Lena's agonized scream pierced the air as sanctuary staff rushed toward the scene, radios crackling with urgent calls for medical assistance. No one noticed the massive silver-haired figure emerging from the shadows of the enclosure, moving with deliberate curiosity toward the unconscious child. Chaos erupted at Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary as Jamie Callahan's small body lay motionless on the enclosure floor. Visitors pressed against viewing windows, their horrified screams piercing the afternoon air. Security personnel sprinted along the promenade, radios crackling with urgent commands while sanctuary staff frantically attempted to secure the area. "My baby! Please, someone help my baby!" Lena Callahan's desperate cries rose above the pandemonium, her hands clutching the railing where her son had stood moments before. The young mother collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face as onlookers tried to comfort her. Dr. Eloise Trenholm arrived breathless, her usual composure shattered as she assessed the situation with growing dread. "Keep everyone back," she ordered, signaling to Malik Gora, who was already moving toward the emergency protocols panel. Then, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Kumba, the magnificent silverback, emerged from his rocky shelter. 200 kilograms of raw power moved with surprising grace across the enclosure. The massive gorilla's knuckles pressed against the soft mulch as he approached the unconscious child. "Don't tranquilize yet," Eloise whispered into her radio, raising her hand to halt the response team. "Wait." Time seemed to freeze. Parents pulled their children close. Phones recorded what many feared would be a tragedy. Ron Abernathy arrived, his face ashen as he prepared to make the most difficult decision of his career. But Kumba defied every expectation. The silverback settled his enormous frame beside Jamie with remarkable gentleness. A series of low, rumbling sounds emanated from his chest, vocalizations Eloise had never documented in 15 years of research. The gorilla's massive hand, capable of bending steel bars, hovered protectively over the boy's back, never quite touching him. "He's guarding him," Malik murmured in disbelief. The crowd fell silent, witnessing something that transcended their understanding of the natural world. A mother wept quietly. A security guard lowered his tranquilizer gun. Even Reverend Agnes Fairweather, who had been leading a church group tour, crossed herself in wonder. For 3 agonizing minutes, Kumba maintained his vigil, occasionally glancing toward the gathering crowd with what could only be described as concern. When the emergency medical team finally accessed the enclosure through a secure side entrance, the silverback retreated several steps, not in aggression, but in what appeared to be a deliberate yielding of space. As paramedics carefully lifted Jamie's limp form onto a stretcher, Kumba watched from a respectful distance, his deep brown eyes following their every movement until they disappeared from view. No one who witnessed those moments would ever forget them. By nightfall, shaky footage would begin circulating online, and by morning, what happened in that enclosure would challenge everything the world thought it knew about the boundaries between human and animal empathy. The emergency response team arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the stunned silence that had fallen over the sanctuary. Paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, carefully extracting Jamie Callahan from the enclosure, while animal handlers kept Kumba at a safe distance. The boy's small body was quickly secured to a stretcher and rushed to the waiting ambulance, his mother following in a daze of terror and disbelief. At Bristol Royal Infirmary, doctors marveled at Jamie's condition. What should have been catastrophic injuries amounted to just minor bruises, a small gash on his forehead, and a slight concussion. "It's nothing short of miraculous," the attending physician told Lena, who could barely process his words through her fog of guilt. Lena sat beside her son's hospital bed, her fingers trembling as she stroked his hair. "I only looked away for a second," she whispered to the nurse who brought tea she couldn't drink, the weight of what might have happened pressed down on her chest like a stone. Outside the room, journalists gathered like shadows, their cameras and questions held at bay only by hospital security. Back at Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary, Ron Abernathy paced the length of the conference room, his face ashen. "This could ruin us," the director muttered, loosening his tie as staff members filed in for the emergency meeting. Insurance representatives, legal advisors, and board members exchanged grim looks across the polished table. Dr. Eloise Trenholm sat apart from the others, her normally composed demeanor fractured by exhaustion. The primatologist had spent 23 years studying gorilla behavior, yet nothing in her extensive research had prepared her for what she'd witnessed. She replayed the scene in her mind, Kumba's gentle approach, his protective posture, the almost tender way he'd positioned himself near the child. "We need to review all security protocols immediately," Abernathy announced, his voice cutting through Eloise's thoughts, "and prepare a statement that minimizes our liability." Eloise looked up sharply. "What about Kumba?" His behavior was extraordinary. He protected that boy. "That's not the narrative the media will run with," the director replied dismissively. "A child fell into a dangerous animals enclosure on our watch." As the meeting devolved into arguments about barriers and signage, Eloise slipped away to the monitoring station. On the screen, she could see Kumba sitting quietly in his enclosure, seemingly contemplative. The veterinarian rubbed her tired eyes, wondering if she'd missed something fundamental about these creatures she'd devoted her life to understanding. In the hospital room, Jamie stirred awake, his small voice surprising his mother. "The big gorilla was nice to me," he said simply. Lena squeezed his hand, tears spilling down her cheeks as she realized how differently this day could have ended. The grainy cell phone footage spread like wildfire across social media platforms. The shaky images captured Jamie Callahan's fall, and Kumba's gentle response with startling clarity, despite the panicked breathing of the person recording. Within 3 hours, the video had amassed over 2 million views, and by nightfall, #KumbaTheHero was trending nationwide. The BBC arrived at Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary by early evening, their sleek vans with satellite dishes parked prominently near the entrance. Impeccably dressed reporters with crisp accents stood before cameras, their voices carrying the gravity of the moment as they described the extraordinary display of cross-species compassion. Behind them, the sanctuary's entrance had transformed into an impromptu memorial, with stuffed animals, handwritten notes, and children's drawings piling up against the gates. "What we witnessed today defies conventional understanding of great ape behavior," intoned one broadcaster, as sweeping orchestral music underscored footage of Kumba's enclosure, now empty as the silverback had been moved to a quieter area away from the growing crowds. In the small town hall of Westbridge, emergency community meetings stretched late into the night. Reverend Agnes Fairweather stood before the packed room, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light as she spoke with quiet conviction. Perhaps this is more than coincidence, the church leader suggested, her hands clasped before her. In a world so divided, Kumba has shown us something profound about the nature of compassion. Her words resonated through the crowded space, transforming what might have been a safety discussion into something approaching spiritual revelation. Local shopkeepers who had never shown interest in wildlife conservation now spoke passionately about our Kumba and our sanctuary. Lena Callahan sat at the back of the meeting hall, overwhelmed by the attention. She clutched her smartphone tightly, having turned off notifications after hundreds of messages flooded in from strangers worldwide. The mother's expression shifted between bewilderment and exhaustion as she heard her son and the gorilla discussed by people who knew neither. Ron Abernathy watched the proceedings with calculated concern. The sanctuary director recognized both opportunity and danger in the public's sudden fascination. He made careful notes on potential donors among the emotional crowd while simultaneously drafting statements about improved safety measures. By midnight, international news agencies had picked up the story. Americans woke to footage of Kumba on their morning shows, while across Asia, the video became the day's most shared content. What had begun as a terrifying accident was rapidly transforming into something else entirely. A global conversation about empathy that transcended species, and a public sentiment that would soon force the sanctuary's leadership to reconsider Kumba's future and their own understanding of the creatures in their care. The sanctuary had fallen quiet hours ago. Dr. Eloise Trenholm sat alone in her office, the only light coming from her desk lamp and the glow of her computer screen. The familiar scent of chamomile tea wafted from the chipped mug beside her keyboard, a gift from a former student, now yellowed with age like the textbooks lining her shelves. "Play it again," she whispered to herself, clicking the replay button for what must have been the 30th time that evening. The grainy security footage showed the moment that had shaken her professional foundation, Kumba's approach to Jamie Callahan's motionless form. Eloise leaned forward, scrutinizing every pixel. The silverback's movements contradicted everything she'd taught in her university lectures. There was no chest beating, no display of dominance, just deliberate gentleness as the massive primate positioned himself between the child and the rest of the troop. "This isn't just protective behavior," she murmured, making another notation in her leather-bound journal. "This is something else." The veteran primatologist rubbed her eyes, feeling the weight of 40 years of scientific certainty beginning to crack. She'd built her career on objective observation, on keeping emotional distance from her subjects, yet Kumba's actions defied simple categorization. She reached for a weathered photo frame on her desk, herself as a young woman, standing proudly beside her first research subject. How confident she'd been then, so sure of the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. "What if I've been wrong all this time?" The question hung in the air of her cluttered office. Eloise replayed the footage again, this time focusing on Kumba's eyes. There was something there, something that reminded her of another pair of eyes she'd once known. Her mind drifted to memories she'd long suppressed. A baby girl she'd given up decades ago, when her career seemed more important than motherhood. The primatologist stood abruptly, walking to the window overlooking the darkened sanctuary grounds. In the distance, she could make out the silhouette of the gorilla enclosure where Kumba now slept. Had she missed something fundamental in her decades of research? Had her insistence on scientific detachment blinded her to deeper truths about animal consciousness? And perhaps about herself? Tomorrow, Ron Abernathy would expect her professional assessment of the incident. The board would want reassurances, liability analyses, risk management strategies. But tonight, alone with her doubts, Dr. Eloise Trenholm faced a more personal question. What if the greatest discovery of her career wasn't just about gorilla behavior, but about the nature of empathy itself? She returned to her desk, opened a fresh page in her journal, and began to write with a trembling hand. "Today I must consider the possibility that I've been wrong." The morning mist still clung to the sanctuary grounds as Malik Gora arrived for his early shift. 3 weeks had passed since the incident, and the young zookeeper had barely taken a day off. His dedication to Kumba had intensified, driven by something deeper than professional obligation. "My grandfather would have understood," Malik whispered to himself as he prepared Kumba's breakfast. His thoughts drifted to childhood summers in Nairobi, where his grandfather had worked with wildlife conservation efforts. Those memories fueled his passion now, especially during these uncertain times at Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary. The silverback had been unusually quiet since Jamie's fall. While other staff members attributed this to the stress of the incident and subsequent media attention, Malik sensed something more profound in Kumba's demeanor, a deliberateness that seemed almost contemplative. That morning, as he entered the enclosure for cleaning, Malik noticed Kumba sitting in a far corner, methodically arranging small branches and leaves. The junior keeper paused, careful not to disturb what appeared to be purposeful behavior. From his vantage point, the pattern seemed random at first, until Malik shifted his perspective. "It can't be," he whispered, heart racing. The arrangement of sticks formed a crude but unmistakable shape, the outline of a small airplane, remarkably similar to the toy Jamie had been clutching before his fall. The toy that had been left behind, broken in the commotion. Malik pulled out his smartphone with trembling hands, capturing several photos from different angles. He knew what he was seeing defied conventional understanding of gorilla behavior, yet the evidence was right before his eyes. Should I tell Dr. Trenholm? He wondered aloud. Eloise's scientific reputation was legendary, but her skepticism was equally renowned. Would she dismiss his observation as the imagination of an overeager intern? The sanctuary was already under intense scrutiny. Would this help or harm Kumba's situation? Over the next 3 days, the young zookeeper documented everything. He noted how the silverback would dismantle and rebuild the stick formation each morning, sometimes adding new elements, sometimes simplifying the design. Malik started keeping a journal, recording times, behaviors, and possible interpretations. His excitement grew with each observation, but so did his anxiety. The scientific community might ridicule him. Ron Abernathy would likely see this as another PR complication. Yet Malik couldn't shake the feeling that what he was witnessing was extraordinary, a form of communication, perhaps even mourning or longing. "I need to be certain," he told himself, tucking his notebook away as he heard footsteps approaching. "Completely certain before I tell anyone." What Malik couldn't know was that his discovery would soon become a crucial piece in understanding the remarkable connection between a gentle giant and a small boy who had accidentally entered his world. "Can I see the big monkey again?" Jamie asked one evening, his small hand clutching a spoonful of cereal that hovered midway to his mouth. Lena Callahan nearly dropped the plate she was washing. She turned to face her son, searching his innocent eyes for any sign of trauma. Instead, she found only curiosity and something that resembled longing. "Sweetheart, I don't think that's a good idea," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. "What happened was very dangerous." Jamie shook his head with the simple certainty only children possess. "He didn't hurt me, Mummy." He was nice. He made the scary feeling go away. The boy's words haunted Lena through the night, while Jamie slept peacefully, clutching his new plush gorilla toy, a replacement for the one he'd spotted before the fall. His mother paced their modest Bristol flat, torn between maternal protection and the undeniable fact that her son showed no fear of the creature that could have ended his life. By morning, Jamie's innocent request had somehow reached the local press. A neighbor, overhearing their conversation at the corner shop, had mentioned it to her sister, who worked at the Bristol Herald. By afternoon, the story had spread to national outlets. "Child seeks reunion with silverback savior," screamed one headline. "Boy wants to thank Gorilla Guardian," proclaimed another. Dr. Eloise Trenholm's phone rang incessantly at the sanctuary. The primatologist fielded calls from BBC reporters, animal behaviorists from Cambridge, and ethics committees demanding statements. Between calls, she watched Kumba through the observation window, noting how the silverback seemed to scan each group of visitors, as if searching for someone specific. "This could be unprecedented research opportunity," Malik suggested during their afternoon rounds, his voice low but excited. "Or it could be a disaster," Eloise countered, though her scientific curiosity was clearly piqued. Meanwhile, Ron Abernathy convened emergency meetings with the sanctuary's legal team. "The publicity could save us," the director admitted, "but if anything went wrong..." The debate spilled into public forums. Parents on social media condemned Lena for even considering another encounter. Animal rights activists argued that Kumba deserved to see the child he had protected. Psychologists weighed in about potential trauma for Jamie, while primatologists debated Kumba's motivations. Through it all, Lena found herself caught in a storm of judgment. Each night, Jamie would ask again, his voice growing more insistent, and each night she would lie awake, wondering if she was protecting her son or denying him something profound, a connection that defied human understanding but seemed as real to Jamie as the ground beneath his feet. The solicitor's letter arrived on Ron Abernathy's desk on a Tuesday morning, its official letterhead bearing the name of a prominent Manchester law firm. Lena Callahan's family had connections, and they were using them. The letter outlined potential claims of gross negligence, inadequate safety measures, and psychological trauma suffered by both Jamie and his mother. "This is preposterous," Ron muttered, running his fingers through his thinning hair. The sanctuary director immediately called an emergency board meeting, his voice strained as he explained the situation over the phone. "We can't afford this kind of publicity, let alone a settlement." Meanwhile, Lena sat in her sister's kitchen in Manchester, staring blankly at her tea. "You have to pursue this," her older brother insisted, his hand firmly on her shoulder. "They put Jamie at risk." What if Kumba had reacted differently? Though guilt gnawed at her for her momentary distraction that day, the pressure from her family was relentless. The lawsuit felt wrong, but what choice did she have? Back at Westbridge, Dr. Eloise Trenholm found herself summoned to Ron's office. The veterinarian stood rigid as the director suggested she consider early retirement. "Someone needs to take responsibility," he explained, not quite meeting her eyes. "The board thinks your protocols for Kumba's enclosure were insufficient." "My protocols?" Eloise's voice was dangerously quiet. "Those railings were approved by your budget committee, Ron. They rejected my request for higher barriers 3 times. The board meeting that followed was tense. Eloise watched as decades of her work were reduced to a liability discussion. These people in their pressed suits talked about Kumba as if he were merely an asset on a spreadsheet, not a sentient being with complex emotions. "We should consider transferring Kumba to another facility," one board member suggested. "Distance ourselves from the incident?" Eloise's knuckles turned white as she gripped her pen. "He's not a piece of furniture you can simply move when it becomes inconvenient." In the gorilla enclosure, Malik Gora observed Kumba with growing concern. The silverback barely touched his morning fruit, spending hours staring at the spot where Jamie had fallen. The junior keeper documented everything: decreased appetite, minimal social interaction with other gorillas, repetitive behaviors. "He misses him," Malik whispered to a colleague. "I've never seen anything like it." At night, Eloise reviewed Malik's notes, her scientific mind struggling to reconcile what the data suggested. Animals weren't supposed to form attachments this quickly, this deeply, yet the evidence was undeniable. As lawyers exchanged increasingly hostile letters, and the sanctuary's reputation hung in the balance, the person who could potentially heal this rift, little Jamie, remained at home, asking daily when he could see his gorilla again, unaware of the adult complications keeping them apart. The grainy footage appeared on YouTube without warning. A sanctuary staff member, their identity hidden behind a blurred username, had captured what truly happened that fateful day. The video showed something the official statements had omitted. A second gorilla, agitated by the commotion, had approached Jamie's motionless form. Kumba, with deliberate purpose, had positioned himself between the child and the potential threat, his massive silverback becoming a protective wall. Within 24 hours, the clip had amassed over 2 million views. BBC News featured it prominently, while American networks interrupted regular programming. Dr. Eloise Trenholm's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, as colleagues from Tokyo to Toronto demanded explanations. The primatologist watched the footage repeatedly in her cluttered office, the steam from her forgotten tea curling into the air as she analyzed every frame. "This changes everything," she whispered to Malik Gora, who stood transfixed beside her desk. The young zookeeper nodded silently, vindicated in his belief that Kumba possessed extraordinary empathy. Outside Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary, camera crews established makeshift studios. Ron Abernathy, looking haggard in his wrinkled suit, delivered carefully worded statements that neither confirmed nor denied the implications of Kumba's actions. The sanctuary director's eyes darted nervously as reporters shouted questions about animal consciousness and the ethics of captivity. Social media exploded with hashtags. Kumba the Hero and Gorilla Guardian trended globally. Animal rights organizations seized the moment, demanding new legislation recognizing great ape personhood. Meanwhile, religious commentators, including Reverend Agnes Fairweather, spoke of divine inspiration in Kumba's actions. "God works through all his creatures," the Reverend told her congregation, many of whom nodded tearfully. Lena Callahan watched the viral phenomenon unfold from Jamie's hospital room, her lawsuit suddenly complicated by public sentiment. How could she vilify the sanctuary when millions were celebrating Kumba as a hero? Her smartphone filled with messages from strangers, some supportive, others accusing her of negligent parenting. By week's end, tourists clogged Westbridge's narrow streets. Families pressed against the visitor center windows, hoping for glimpses of the famous silverback. Souvenir shops hastily printed T-shirts bearing Kumba's image. Scientists from Cambridge and Oxford arrived with research proposals, while documentary filmmakers pitched concepts to sanctuary management. Amid the chaos, Kumba himself remained oblivious to his celebrity. The gorilla continued his daily routines, though keepers noticed he often paused near the spot where Jamie had fallen, his deep brown eyes seeming to search for something, or someone, missing. For Eloise, Malik, and the entire sanctuary staff, the viral video had transformed a potential tragedy into something far more complex. A moment that challenged humanity's understanding of itself and its closest animal relatives. The sanctuary staff watched with growing concern as Kumba's behavior deteriorated day by day. The magnificent silverback, who once commanded his enclosure with quiet dignity, now paced relentlessly along the perimeter, his massive shoulders hunched forward. His food, the carefully prepared fruits and vegetables that he typically devoured with enthusiasm, lay untouched in piles. "He's not eaten properly in 3 days," Malik Gora reported, his voice tight with worry as he showed Dr. Eloise Trenholm the daily logs. The young zookeeper had been spending extra hours observing the gorilla, noting every change with meticulous attention. Eloise studied Kumba through the observation window. The gorilla's deep brown eyes, usually alert and assessing, now seemed distant and clouded with what she could only describe as sorrow. 20 years of primatology had taught her to avoid anthropomorphizing, but something about Kumba's demeanor transcended scientific caution. "This is clinical depression," she finally said, turning to Malik. "I've seen it before in captive primates, but never this severe without physical illness." Later that afternoon in Ron Abernathy's office, Eloise proposed what she knew would sound outrageous. "We need to arrange supervised interaction between Jamie and Kumba." The sanctuary director nearly choked on his tea. "Are you mad?" After what happened, the legal implications alone. "The legal implications of letting a beloved animal waste away aren't much better," Eloise countered. "Besides, the public already sees Kumba as a hero. If word gets out that he's declining after saving a child—" Ron tapped his pen against the desk, his bureaucratic mind calculating risks and rewards. There would need to be safety protocols, multiple barriers, waivers signed. "Of course," Eloise agreed, "but I believe this connection between them is real, and potentially unprecedented in documented animal behavior." Outside the office, Malik pretended to be organizing files while eavesdropping. A smile spread across his face as he heard the director reluctantly agree to consider the proposal. The young man had been documenting subtle behaviors in Kumba that suggested far more than instinctual responses. The way the gorilla would arrange items in patterns similar to objects Jamie had carried, how he would pause and stare at the spot where the boy had fallen. That evening, as Malik completed his final checks, he paused at Kumba's enclosure. The gorilla sat motionless, staring at the visitor area where families had stood that day. "We're going to help you," Malik whispered through the glass. "I promise." For the first time in days, Kumba turned his head, his gaze meeting the keepers with what seemed like a flicker of hope. The morning of the supervised reunion dawned with a pale English sun filtering through clouds over Westbridge. After weeks of heated discussions, liability forms, and emergency protocols, the day had finally arrived. Jamie Callahan, clutching his mother's hand, approached the sanctuary's special visitation area with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Remember what we talked about," Lena whispered, kneeling to meet her son's eyes. "You stay behind the glass at all times." Her voice betrayed the internal struggle, the maternal instinct to protect warring with her growing curiosity about the connection between her child and the silverback. Dr. Eloise Trenholm stood nearby, clipboard in hand, her professional demeanor barely concealing her scientific anticipation. Behind her, a small crowd had gathered, 3 primatologists from Cambridge, a BBC journalist, Reverend Agnes Fairweather, and several townspeople who had supported keeping Kumba at the sanctuary. "We're ready when you are," the veterinarian said softly to Lena, who nodded and guided Jamie toward the specially reinforced glass-walled observation area. Malik Gora waited inside, having spent the morning preparing Kumba with extra fruit and gentle encouragement. The young zookeeper gave Jamie a reassuring smile. "He's been waiting for you," he said, pointing toward the adjacent enclosure where Kumba was just becoming visible through the foliage. The silverback emerged slowly, his massive frame moving with surprising grace. He paused, nostrils flaring as he caught Jamie's scent. For a moment the entire room held its breath. Ron Abernathy's hand hovered near the emergency alarm, his eyes darting nervously between the gorilla and the glass barrier. Kumba approached with deliberate steps, his deep brown eyes fixed on Jamie. The boy, initially frozen in place, suddenly moved forward until he stood directly before the glass. Without prompting, Kumba raised his enormous hand and pressed his palm flat against the transparent barrier. Jamie looked back at his mother, who nodded through tears. The boy turned and placed his tiny hand against the glass, perfectly aligned with Kumba's massive palm. A collective gasp rippled through the observers. The gorilla's eyes softened, and he emitted a low, rumbling sound that Eloise recognized as contentment. Jamie giggled, his face lighting up with wonder. "He remembers me," the boy whispered. Lena's anger, the fury that had fueled her lawsuit threats and sleepless nights, seemed to dissolve in that moment. Tears streamed down her face as she watched her son communicate wordlessly with the creature who had protected him. She found herself moving forward, standing behind Jamie, her own hand reaching toward the glass. "Thank you," she mouthed to Kumba, the words barely audible but somehow understood by everyone present. The image of Jamie's tiny hand pressed against the glass, mirroring Kumba's massive palm on the other side, haunted Lena Callahan for days. She sat in her solicitor's office in Bristol, staring at the lawsuit papers that suddenly felt wrong in her hands. The morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the mahogany desk. "I can't do this," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "Not after what I saw." Her solicitor, a pragmatic woman with 20 years of experience, reminded her about the potential settlement. The negligence claim they could easily win. But Lena shook her head, remembering the gentleness in Kumba's eyes. The next day, Lena called a press conference outside Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary. News vans lined the gravel drive, and reporters clutched notepads in the brisk morning air. Standing before the microphones, her auburn hair tousled by the wind, she took a deep breath. "I'm withdrawing all legal action against the sanctuary," she announced, her voice stronger than she expected. "What happened to Jamie was not their fault. It was a mother's momentary lapse in attention. My lapse." Tears welled in her eyes as she continued. "Kumba protected my son when I couldn't. I've spent weeks angry and afraid, but I've realized something important. There was more compassion in that gorilla's actions than in my desire to place blame." Dr. Eloise Trenholm watched from the sanctuary entrance, her usually stoic expression softening. Beside her, Malik Gora couldn't hide his relief. The young zookeeper had spent sleepless nights worrying about Kumba's future if the lawsuit proceeded. The media narrative transformed overnight. Headlines that once read, "Mother sues after child's terrifying fall," now proclaimed, "Forgiveness and understanding. Mother becomes sanctuary advocate." Local BBC coverage featured interviews with community members expressing support for both Lena and the sanctuary. Ron Abernathy, initially stunned by Lena's decision, quickly arranged a private meeting with her. The sanctuary director, ever conscious of public relations, proposed a collaborative education program about animal empathy, with Lena as its spokesperson. For Eloise and Malik, the withdrawal of legal threats meant they could finally focus on what mattered most: Kumba's well-being. The silverback had become noticeably calmer since Jamie's visit, but still showed signs of heightened awareness, often gazing toward the visitor pathway as if waiting. "He remembers," Malik told Eloise as they observed Kumba from the research platform. "He's looking for Jamie." Eloise nodded, allowing herself a rare smile. "Then perhaps we should arrange more visits. For scientific purposes, of course." But they both knew it was more than science now. Something profound had changed at Westbridge, not just for Kumba and Jamie, but for everyone touched by their unexpected connection. The sanctuary buzzed with activity as a team of international primatologists arrived from universities across Europe. Their expensive equipment and clinical demeanor stood in stark contrast to the warm, familiar atmosphere Dr. Eloise Trenholm had cultivated at Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary. The researchers moved with an air of academic superiority that immediately put the regular staff on edge. "Kumba represents a fascinating anomaly," announced Dr. Heinrich Weber, the team leader from Berlin, as he unpacked monitoring devices in the observation room. "We must quantify and categorize his behaviors through rigorous testing." Malik Gora watched with growing unease as the scientists set up their equipment. The young zookeeper had spent enough time with Kumba to recognize the silverback's subtle signs of discomfort, the way his shoulders tensed when strangers approached, how his eyes darted between unfamiliar faces. "He doesn't like changes to his routine," Malik cautioned, but his concerns were dismissed with patronizing smiles. By afternoon, the researchers had implemented a series of cognitive tests involving unfamiliar objects placed in Kumba's enclosure. The gorilla, already agitated by the parade of white-coated strangers, grew increasingly distressed. When a researcher activated a loud electronic tone to test reaction time, Kumba's patience finally broke. The silverback charged the glass barrier with a thunderous roar that sent the research team scrambling backward. Sanctuary staff rushed to implement emergency protocols as Kumba pounded his massive fists against the reinforced glass. His gentle nature seemingly vanished. "Stop this immediately!" Eloise shouted, her usual composure shattered. "Get that equipment out of here now!" It took 3 hours to calm Kumba enough to safely approach him. The veterinarian made the difficult decision to move him to an isolation area, away from visitors and researchers alike, until his stress levels decreased. News of the incident spread quickly through Westbridge. Reverend Agnes Fairweather organized an impromptu prayer circle outside the sanctuary gates, while Ron Abernathy fielded concerned calls from the board members about potential publicity damage. That evening, Eloise confronted Dr. Weber in the sanctuary's conference room, her voice low but trembling with fury. "You treated him like a laboratory specimen, not a sentient being who's been through trauma. Your methods are outdated and cruel." The German researcher adjusted his glasses with a dismissive gesture. "With respect, Dr. Trenholm, your emotional attachment is clouding scientific objectivity." "And your objectivity is blinding you to what's right in front of you," she countered. "If you want to study Kumba, you'll do it on his terms and with my supervision, or not at all." As Eloise left the building that night, she found Malik sitting alone near Kumba's isolation area, keeping a silent vigil. The young man looked up with worried eyes. "Will he be okay?" he asked. Eloise nodded slowly. "He will. But science without compassion isn't science at all. We need to protect him, from them, and from ourselves." Dr. Eloise Trenholm sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor outside Kumba's isolation area, her white coat rumpled from a day that had stretched far too long. The silverback was agitated, pacing back and forth, occasionally stopping to press his massive hand against the glass that separated them. "I know," she whispered. "Those researchers treated you like a lab specimen, didn't they?" Kumba suddenly stopped pacing. He raised his right hand, curling his fingers into a distinct pattern before tapping his chest. Eloise froze. The gesture was unmistakable, one she hadn't seen in years. "That's impossible," she murmured, leaning forward. "Do it again." The gorilla repeated the motion, adding a second gesture that resembled a wave toward his mouth. Something buried in Eloise's memory stirred to life. These weren't random movements. They were rudimentary signs she'd seen documented in old training logs from the 1980s. Malik Gora found her there 3 hours later, surrounded by dusty binders and faded papers. "You missed dinner," he said, setting down a cup of tea beside her. "What's all this?" "Look at this footage," she replied, pointing to her tablet. "Then look at these old notes." The junior keeper squinted at the yellowed pages. "These are sign language attempts. From 25 years ago. But there's more." Eloise ran her fingers through her graying hair. "I need you to check the archives for anything from Professor Martin Holloway. He was my mentor. Brilliant, but discredited." 2 days later, Malik burst into Eloise's office clutching a leather-bound journal. "I found it hidden behind the old reference books. Your mentor's private research notes." They pored over the journal together, discovering Holloway had documented similar empathetic behaviors in captive gorillas, findings dismissed by the scientific community as anthropomorphism. "Look at this entry," Malik pointed excitedly. "Subject exhibits intentional teaching behavior." That's exactly what we're seeing with Kumba. Over the next week, they observed something extraordinary. Kumba wasn't just signing. He was teaching Nuru, a younger female gorilla, the same gestures. When she successfully mimicked him, he would share extra fruit with her. "This changes everything," Eloise whispered, watching the gorillas interact. "It's cultural transmission. They're passing knowledge between generations." Malik nodded, his eyes bright with wonder. "And it started after Jamie's fall. It's like that connection awakened something in him." "Or reminded him," Eloise corrected, thinking of her mentor's discarded theories. "Perhaps we've been underestimating their emotional capacity all along." That night, as she updated her research notes, Eloise felt decades of scientific detachment crumbling. The gorilla who had saved a little boy was now challenging everything she thought she knew about animal consciousness, and forcing her to confront the emotions she'd spent a lifetime suppressing. Dark clouds had been gathering over Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary all morning, casting an ominous shadow across the autumn landscape. Jamie Callahan and his mother Lena had come for their now regular visit with Kumba, ignoring the weather warnings that had kept most visitors away. The sanctuary felt eerily quiet, except for the distant rumble of thunder. "Perhaps we should head back," Lena suggested, eyeing the darkening sky through the visitor center windows, but Jamie's pleading eyes won her over. "Just 15 minutes with Kumba, then we go." They had barely reached the gorilla enclosure when the first lightning strike hit. The lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the entire sanctuary into darkness. Emergency generators kicked in seconds later, but only partially, casting eerie red emergency lighting across the pathways. "All visitors please proceed calmly to the main exit," announced a strained voice over the crackling PA system. Sanctuary staff appeared, flashlights in hand, guiding confused guests toward safety. Malik Gora rushed past, radio crackling with urgent messages. "Power surge has compromised some of the security systems," he explained hurriedly to Dr. Eloise Trenholm, who had appeared from her office. "Ron's worried about the east sector gates." Rain began hammering against the roof as visitors huddled in the main hall. Jamie clung to his mother, eyes wide with worry not for himself but for the animals. "Will Kumba be okay?" he whispered. Back in the gorilla habitat, something extraordinary was happening. Kumba, sensing the disruption, moved with purpose toward the viewing glass. The massive silverback began a rhythmic pounding against the reinforced barrier, his movements deliberate and insistent. "He's agitated by the storm," one keeper suggested, but Eloise shook her head. "No, he's trying to tell us something." The primatologist approached the glass cautiously. Kumba stopped pounding and gestured repeatedly toward the far corner of the enclosure, where a service gate was showing signs of malfunction, its electronic lock blinking erratically. "The backup system is failing on that gate," Eloise realized with horror. If it opened, nothing would prevent Kumba and the other gorillas from wandering into visitor areas, a potentially catastrophic scenario for both humans and animals. Staff rushed to secure the gate manually while Kumba watched, his intelligent eyes following their movements. When the danger had passed, the silverback returned to his usual spot, seemingly satisfied. Later, reviewing security footage in Ron Abernathy's office, the sanctuary director shook his head in disbelief. He wasn't trying to escape. He was warning us. Lena, who had refused to leave until she knew all animals were safe, held Jamie's hand tightly. "He protected everyone," the boy said simply, a statement that would be repeated in news reports across the country the following day. The storm had passed, but its revelation remained. Kumba had once again demonstrated an awareness that challenged everything they thought they knew about gorilla intelligence. Frost etched delicate patterns on the windows of Eloise Trenholm's cottage as she poured 2 steaming mugs of Earl Grey. Outside, Bristol had transformed into a winter wonderland, the sanctuary grounds blanketed in pristine white. Lena Callahan sat across from her at the kitchen table, both women drawn together by their shared concern for Jamie and Kumba. "He still has nightmares sometimes," Lena confessed, cupping the warm mug between her palms. "But they're different now. He's not falling anymore. He dreams Kumba is teaching him to climb trees." The primatologist nodded, her usually stern features softening. These weekly meetings had become a ritual neither woman had planned, yet both now needed. "Jamie has a resilience I've rarely seen," Eloise said. "Children often surprise us with their capacity to heal." Lena's eyes grew distant. "I lost a baby before Jamie, a little girl." Her voice cracked slightly. "Stillborn at 36 weeks, that's why I'm so protective." Eloise froze, her mug suspended midway to her lips. "When was this?" 23 years ago. I was very young, just 17. Lena tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "My parents arranged a private adoption for me when I got pregnant. But then I couldn't give her up. I ran away to Manchester to raise her myself." She swallowed hard. "When I lost her, something inside me broke. Jamie was my second chance." The older woman's hands trembled as she set down her tea. Specific details from Lena's story aligned with memories she'd locked away decades ago. A pregnant teenager from Bristol, due in April, who had disappeared before the adoption could be finalized. "The adoption agency," Eloise whispered. "Was it Bright Hope Family Services?" Lena looked up sharply. "How could you possibly know that?" The sanctuary vet took a deep breath. "Because 23 years ago I was a doctoral student who couldn't raise a child alone. I arranged to give my baby to a family through Bright Hope." Her voice faltered. "I never knew what happened to her. To you." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock. Lena stared at Eloise, searching for her own features in the older woman's face. The same high cheekbones, the same determined set of the jaw. "That's impossible," Lena finally whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Your birthmark," Eloise said quietly. "A small crescent on your right shoulder blade." Lena's hand instinctively moved to touch the spot through her sweater. The two women regarded each other across the table, connected by blood, by Jamie, by Kumba, and by a twist of fate neither could have imagined. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering Westbridge in a hushed blanket of white, while inside, two lives that had circled each other unknowingly for months finally collided in a moment of painful, beautiful truth. The sanctuary veterinary team huddled around Kumba's enclosure, their faces etched with concern. Dr. Eloise Trenholm's practiced hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the latest test results. The silverback's immune system was faltering under the weight of constant scrutiny and disruption to his routine. Cameras, researchers, and the endless parade of curious onlookers had taken their toll. "His white blood cell count is dangerously low," Eloise explained to Malik Gora, who hadn't left Kumba's side in 3 days. "The stress has compromised his entire system." The massive gorilla lay listlessly on his side, barely acknowledging the familiar faces around him. His once bright eyes had dulled, and he refused even his favorite treats. The junior keeper placed a gentle hand on the glass, his throat tight with emotion. "He was fine when Jamie visited last week," Malik observed. "Did you notice how he perked up?" Eloise paused, her scientific mind racing through possibilities. She'd spent decades maintaining professional distance from her subjects, but Kumba had shattered those boundaries. The veterinarian recalled how the gorilla's demeanor transformed whenever the boy was present, his posture straightening, eyes brightening, appetite returning. "We need Jamie," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Convincing Lena Callahan proved challenging. The mother had only recently begun to process her own trauma from the incident, and the revelation about her biological connection to Eloise complicated matters further. "You want my son to visit a sick gorilla?" Lena asked incredulously over the phone. "After everything we've been through?" "I wouldn't ask if there were any other option," Eloise replied, her usual authority softened by genuine concern. "Something about Jamie's presence seems to heal Kumba. I can't explain it scientifically, but I've seen it." After 3 days of deliberation and reassurances about safety protocols, Lena reluctantly agreed. Jamie, however, needed no convincing. The child practically bounced with excitement as he entered the sanctuary's special viewing area. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. Kumba, who had barely moved for days, lumbered to the glass partition upon seeing the boy. The gorilla pressed his enormous palm against the barrier, matching it to Jamie's tiny hand on the other side. "He remembers me!" Jamie exclaimed, his face illuminated with joy. Over the following weeks, these visits became regular occurrences. Each time, Kumba showed visible improvement, eating properly, engaging with enrichment activities, even displaying playful behaviors toward the younger gorillas. Malik meticulously documented every interaction, building a compelling case for animal-human connection that transcended conventional understanding. Eloise watched with growing wonder as her scientific paradigms shifted before her eyes. "Some bonds can't be explained by textbooks," she admitted to Lena during one of Jamie's visits. "Whatever connects them is healing them both." And it was true. With each encounter, both boy and gorilla seemed to draw strength from one another, their unlikely friendship becoming a testament to empathy's power to bridge even the most profound differences. The sanctuary board meeting had been called under the guise of financial restructuring, but the real agenda remained hidden from most staff. In the wood-paneled conference room, Ron Abernathy cleared his throat nervously as he presented the proposal to 6 solemn-faced board members. "The offer from Al-Wahat Wildlife Collection in Dubai is substantial," Ron explained, sliding glossy brochures across the table. £500,000 for Kumba alone. It would solve our budget crisis overnight. The news leaked when a sympathetic board secretary left meeting minutes visible on a photocopier. Malik Gora discovered them during his evening rounds and immediately called Dr. Eloise Trenholm, his voice trembling with urgency. "They're planning to sell him," the young zookeeper whispered into his phone. "By next month." Eloise felt her world collapse. After everything they'd learned about Kumba's intelligence and emotional capacity, the thought of shipping him thousands of miles away to be displayed as an exotic attraction was unbearable. She contacted Lena Callahan immediately. "They can't do this," Lena said, her voice hardening with resolve. Jamie would be devastated. We all would. The three formed an unlikely alliance, meeting at Eloise's cottage to plan their resistance. Malik brought research demonstrating how transfers often shortened gorilla lifespans. Lena contributed her newfound media connections. Eloise supplied scientific credibility and decades of community respect. Their first step was contacting Reverend Agnes Fairweather, whose Sunday sermon on guardianship of creation brought the congregation to tears. By Monday morning, handwritten petitions circulated through Westbridge shops. Local radio station Bristol FM dedicated an entire morning show to call-ins about Kumba, with Jamie himself speaking on air. "He's my friend," the boy said simply. "He saved me." The campaign spread across social media with the hashtag #Keep Kumba Home. Villagers who had never set foot in the sanctuary now stood outside with homemade signs. When the Bristol Post ran a front-page story featuring a photograph of Kumba watching Jamie through the glass, donations began pouring in. The movement culminated in an emergency town hall meeting. The community center overflowed, with residents spilling onto the pavement outside. One by one, people stepped forward to speak. School children who had drawn pictures of Kumba, retired zoologists offering expertise, local business owners pledging support. When Eloise finally took the microphone, her usually measured voice cracked with emotion. "Kumba isn't just an asset on a balance sheet," she said. "He's shown us something profound about connection across species. He belongs here, with us, with Jamie." The board members, sitting uncomfortably in the front row, exchanged glances. The sanctuary wasn't just facing public pressure, it was witnessing the transformation of a community. What had begun as a frightening accident had become Westbridge's defining story, one they were determined to continue writing together. With the sanctuary's future secured, Lena Callahan made the life-changing decision to relocate closer to Bristol. She found a modest cottage just 15 minutes from Westbridge, its garden overlooking the rolling English countryside. The move wasn't merely geographical, it represented a profound shift in her priorities and purpose. Once consumed by anxiety and guilt, Lena discovered a newfound calling as a wildlife education advocate, speaking at local schools about conservation and the emotional lives of animals. "I never imagined I'd be doing this," she confided to Eloise one afternoon, as they watched Jamie pressing his small palm against the reinforced glass of Kumba's enclosure. "But after everything that's happened, how could I not?" Jamie, who had once clung fearfully to his mother's side, now displayed remarkable independence. The boy who had accidentally fallen into a gorilla enclosure begged daily to visit his unlikely friend. "Mom, can we see Kumba today?" Please became his morning mantra. The trauma that might have scarred another child had instead opened Jamie's world, kindling a passion for animals that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Meanwhile, Malik Gora's meticulous documentation of Kumba's behaviors had caught the attention of prominent researchers from Cambridge University. His careful observations, once dismissed as the overeager notes of an intern, were now being published in respected scientific journals. The Sanctuary Board, recognizing his talent, promoted him to lead behavioral researcher, a position created specifically to honor his contributions. "Your grandfather would be immensely proud," Eloise told him during their weekly meeting, her voice softening with genuine affection. "You've seen what others missed for decades." For Dr. Eloise Trenholm herself, the most profound transformation was perhaps the most personal. After 30 years of maintaining professional distance from both humans and animals, she found herself embracing the messy, beautiful complexity of connection. The stoic veterinarian who had once hidden behind clinical terminology now spent Sunday afternoons having tea with her newly discovered daughter and grandson. "I'm retiring next spring," she announced to Lena one evening, their relationship still tender but strengthening with each conversation. "I've given my life to science. Perhaps it's time to give some to family." The sanctuary that had nearly closed its doors now flourished with renewed purpose. Visitors came not just to see exotic animals, but to witness the remarkable bond between a silverback gorilla and a little boy, a relationship that challenged conventional understanding of empathy across species. For the Callahan family and their extended circle, life had been irreversibly altered by a single moment of terror that had, against all odds, blossomed into something miraculous. Daffodils and bluebells carpeted the grounds of Westbridge Wildlife Sanctuary as April sunshine warmed the morning air. Dr. Eloise Trenholm stood before 30 eager pensioners in the newly renovated education center, her silver hair catching the light as she gestured toward the observation window where Kumba sat watching them. "Notice how he tilts his head slightly," Eloise explained, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found peace with her life's work. "That's his way of acknowledging familiar faces." The elderly audience leaned forward in unison as the massive silverback made a series of gentle hand movements toward the glass. Jamie Callahan, now sporting a Westbridge Junior Ranger badge, pressed his palm against the barrier. The boy had become a regular fixture at the sanctuary, his weekend visits evolving into an unofficial internship under Malik's watchful guidance. Kumba responded with a soft chest pat, a gesture that had become their private greeting. "1 year ago we nearly lost everything," Eloise continued, her eyes finding Lena at the back of the room. Mother and daughter exchanged small smiles, their relationship still tender, but healing with each passing month. The revelation of their biological connection had brought both pain and redemption, much like the incident that had first brought them together. The sanctuary itself had transformed. Donations had poured in following the community campaign, allowing for expanded educational programs and improved enclosures. Ron Abernathy, once focused solely on damage control, now proudly showcased Westbridge as a model for animal welfare and conservation. After the lecture, Malik Gora led a small group to view the younger gorillas. The junior keeper moved with newfound authority, his research on Kumba's communication patterns having been published in a respected scientific journal. His grandfather would have been proud. "He's teaching them," Jamie whispered excitedly as Kumba demonstrated a sign to 2 juvenile gorillas. "Just like you taught me." Eloise nodded, allowing herself to feel the wonder she had suppressed for decades behind scientific detachment. Tomorrow she would clean out her office, passing the mantle to younger hands, but today she savored this moment. 3 generations connected through an unexpected chain of events. Reverend Agnes Fairweather, who had rallied the community during the sanctuary's darkest hour, often said that miracles came in mysterious forms. Perhaps she was right. A frightening fall had somehow mended broken hearts, reunited a mother and daughter, launched a promising career, and revealed profound truths about the creatures humans shared the world with. As visitors departed and spring twilight settled over Westbridge, Eloise watched Jamie wave goodbye to Kumba. The boy who tumbled into a gorilla's world had reminded everyone that empathy transcended species, and that sometimes the most profound teachers arrived in the most unexpected forms.